Okay.
Wait, I'm not actually gonna be.
No, you're gonna be here.
Why?
Because you're gonna be helping me feed. Okay.
Am I actually in the video?
Yeah. Alright, hey guys, what's up? So today I'm gonna be doing a review on two rackets. This one is the Vcore 98 2023, and this one's gonna be the Ezone 98 2022. So first of all, these rackets aren't like rackets that I would normally use, but I'm gonna try to give my unbiased opinion on like what kind of play style or what level of player should be using these rackets. I strung both of these with Solinco Confidential at 50 pounds because that's what I use on my other setup with my radical, so it's just the easiest way. I string everything with the same thing, so it's like the easiest way I can tell what the difference is between the actual racket. Now helping me today is Joyce. She's gonna be feeding me the balls, and hopefully we can get this done. Yeah. Rackets first, which I think makes this a very worthy comparison, because if you look at the specs of the rackets, there you have the Ezone on the left and the Vcore on the right, and when you read the first couple, you're gonna see that they're the exact same specs. So why does Yonex have these two different lines when they're essentially the same specs, almost seeming like they're the same racket? Now let's just go through the specs first. Head size, both 98, length, both the standard length of 27 inches. The string weight is 11.4 on both. The balance is even 6 points headlight on both. The swing weight is 318 on both. And this is where we get the first difference, is where the Ezone has a stiffness rating of 65 and the Vcore has a stiffness rating of 62. Now, I honestly thought it would have been the other way around. I felt like the Vcore was stiffer, but that might be for a different reason I'll talk about later. And here's another difference with the beam width of the Ezone being 23.5 millimeters, 24.5 millimeters, and 19.5 millimeters at like the edge, like the thinnest part. And the beam width for the Vcore being 23 millimeters, and 21 millimeters. Now, I think like the difference in beam width is probably the biggest part of why I felt like the Vcore was actually stiffer than the Ezone, and why I felt like how it felt like actually hitting in real life rather than looking at the specs was that the Vcore was a heavier racket versus the Ezone. Now, I think the Vcore does hit harder than the Ezone, and the Ezone pockets has like a bigger sweet spot in my opinion. The Vcore, in my opinion, has like a stiffer sweet spot where if you hit it, it really like, you get a lot of feedback. Well, more than the Ezone at least. Not nearly as much as the thinner beam rackets, but if you look at the specifications for the Ezone, at its thickest, the beam is thicker, and at its thinnest, the beam is thinner than the Vcore. So that means the Vcore is a little bit more uniform, and that could mean the Ezone is a little more aerodynamic, where when you swing it, it feels like it's just a faster swing going through the ball. And the Vcore is going to feel blockier than the Ezone. I think that's the best way to describe it. And that's why, even though here it says a swing weight and the stiffness is a certain number, I actually felt very differently when I swung these two rackets. Okay, so my first impression of the Ezone, here's me hitting ground strokes, and this is really like maybe the second time I ever hit with this racket. Now, I was surprised at how fast this racket went through the air. Like I said earlier, I think it's because the thinnest part of this beam is thin, and it's so aerodynamic, even though it does have a pretty thick beam, especially compared to my radical. And it's also 6 points headlight, so I'm going to be really early on a lot of shots, and my shots will probably not be going as deep because there won't be as much weight behind the ball. But what I noticed was the sweet spot on this thing was really big, and it definitely suits a player who likes to swing fast and hit a lot of topspin. Excuse my tennis, I haven't played nearly enough, but I'll try to make a good review for you guys. Anyway, for the ground strokes, I think this is a really good ground strokers racket. Like, I think it's just a more player version of the Wilson Clash, where it's more all around. It lets you do a couple more things to where, like, you can still have a little more feel. It's not as much of a trampoline as the Clash is, but it still has a big sweet spot, and you can still get a lot of shape on the ball with this racket. I would probably, I kind of compared the Vcore and the Ezone to the Babolat Pure Drive, but I'm not sure if that's super accurate. I haven't used the Pure Drive in a while. So here's me hitting with the Vcore. Hitting with both rackets, like, right after another, you can really feel the difference, even though, like I said before, the specs were so similar. I felt like the Vcore was harder for me to swing through the air. Not hard, but it's still pretty fast just because it's lighter and more headlight than what I usually use, but it definitely felt heavier than the Ezone. And while the sweet spot, I don't think is a small sweet spot, I think it's stiffer, whereas, like, the ball stays on the Ezone a little bit longer, and with the Vcore you get more of a full, like, hit. When you hit the ball, you can really feel the ball a little bit more. It definitely feels more stiff because I have the same strings on both rackets. So in terms of generating pace, like feeling like the ball is coming off my racket as hard as it should, the Vcore does a little bit more, but I think the Ezone I can swing through the air a lot quicker. So depending on what kind of ball comes to me, that is going to make a very big difference. And with the Vcore, I felt like I was shaping the ball a little bit less than the Ezone, but both are pretty comparable because both just have thick beams that aren't that affected by the ball itself, so they'll just go through the ball for you. Okay, so now I'm going to hit some slices with the Vcore, and off the bat I noticed, well, it's kind of to be expected because I think it is stiffer, or at least the sweet spot feels stiffer, and that the ball doesn't stay on the racket as long. So I think for a lot of the slices you would be trying to hit with this racket, you want to hit more of like a drive slice, because it does have the ability to really, like, cut the ball across the court really fast. I think with sorry Joyce, I almost hit her right there. I personally would prefer more the ability to shape my slices more. Shape being just like the curve of the ball and the height over the net. Having more control over the spin of the ball, just because the dwell time on this racket I don't think is that long, and yet it still hits the ball far out. So I don't have as much feel as in terms of, like, really grabbing the ball on the slice and sending it exactly where I want with the amount of spin that I want. But I mean, if your form is good, like, you'll still be able to slice just fine with this racket. Like, none of these rackets are gonna be bad. They're all good rackets. Anytime I say something is not as good or really good, it's all relative to the tier of rackets that I'm reviewing, and this is definitely a good racket. So right now I'm gonna hit some slices with the Ezone, and kind of as expected, the Ezone felt better slicing just because the dwell time with the ball on the strings was just longer, so I felt like I could really spin the ball how I wanted to spin it, and that gave me more confidence to increase the racket speed because I knew how the shape of my ball was going to be instead of the ball just coming off the strings too quick. Now the one thing though is that when you slice with the Ezone, it feels emptier than with the Vcore. But I think, like, any shot you hit with the Vcore, you're gonna feel like a more stiff hit through the ball than the Ezone, whereas the Ezone feels a little light to me. Even when I hit the ball like straight in the strike zone, right in the center of the racket. Sorry, Joyce, I almost keep hitting you. But as for like getting used to the rackets on the slices, the Ezone, I felt way more comfortable than the Vcore. Alright, so here I'm hitting volleys, and I'm just going to talk about all the volleys together, talk about both rackets. So I think the main difference is going to be the dwell time and how much you can shape your volleys. So with the E-Zone, the dwell time is more. I can spin my volleys and soften the ball a little bit. At the same time, I think the racket is a little bit light feeling for what I'm trying to do, but you can have quicker hands because it's just lighter. Now with the Vcore, I think the put away power on volleys is more because you're not shaping the ball as much on volleys anyway. If you can get to the ball early and really take a good stab with the Vcore, you're going to have a very sharp volley. And with a lot of rackets that I volley with, I prefer them to be more stiff, just not as much of like a trampoline feel. So I actually liked the Vcore more. Sorry, Joyce, for almost hitting you again. I actually liked the Vcore more for the volleys because of I just don't feel like the racket would move around when I made contact with the ball. Now, I think if you're in a volley exchange, I think the E-Zone is easier because it's more maneuverable, but I don't think that's a big deal because the Vcore is kind of light anyway. Alright, so here I'm going to be hitting serves, and I'm just going to be switching in between rackets just because I want to kind of get a feel for both right away, and then I could really feel the difference. So the Vcore, I think, definitely hits harder. It feels like like it repels the ball faster. Like it's a stiffer contact, but the ball comes off the racket faster and harder. And it also feels like the swing weight is more again. Like on every shot with the Vcore, it just felt like the swing weight was more, even though the swing weight was supposed to be the same as the E-Zone on paper. So I think the E-Zone is easier to make, like to hit spins and get shape on the ball with on the serve, which I think for a server like me who really likes to change up the pace, have more variation rather than just serve the ball hard, try to go for aces, I would prefer the E-Zone a little bit more. But that being said, hitting a nice flat serve on the Vcore is really, really nice. On the second serves, I felt like because the E-Zone would grab the ball longer, I was able to shape more topspin onto the ball, and my second serves had more arc. I think if you're a taller player, this won't matter as much. But for me, I try to hit my second serves. I try to get my second serves, especially my kick serve, to bounce and to curve because I want that variation, because it's not just about hitting a nice kick serve to the backhand all the time. I think a lot of it is making them uncomfortable enough on your second serve so that they can't always just attack or know what kind of serve is coming. So one really annoying thing was that for some reason my toss is just not consistent anymore, because I hardly serve, but I kept tossing the ball to the right way too much to hit a second serve or to hit like a decent kick serve on. And that's probably from just like feeding serves to people where I'm tossing it fairly low, like low effort from standing in the front of the baseline and serving at my students. So I didn't feel too comfortable on my kick serves, but for the couple of kick serves that I had where I tossed it correctly, both rackets were fine and I was able to get a decent amount of kick on both of them.
It's just a little bit wide.
Thank you.
Just a little.
So that pretty much wraps up all the strokes, and I hope I gave a little clarity as to what the difference between these two rackets were. Again, I used Selenco Confidential on both of them, and I was actually really interested in what the difference between these rackets were because in my opinion, or before I tried them out, they both seemed to fit the same type of player. But now I know what the slight differences were, and I hope this video really helped you guys as well. And if you guys enjoyed this or gained some information from this racket comparison, don't forget to like and subscribe. That really motivates me to keep making videos on my off time. And as always, I appreciate all of you. Okay, so thank you, Joyce, for feeding me balls. I think overall, I have a good idea of what I like in each of these rackets. Both of them actually hit the ball pretty far, and I think the sweet spot is pretty big. Now, the Vcore felt like it had a much higher swing weight, and the Ezone felt a lot more comfortable. So you kind of have to see what kind of player you are. I think both these rackets are really good for players that like to hit ground strokes. The Ezone, I would say, is probably more consistent and a more comfortable racket to use, while the Vcore is pretty comfortable. I feel like the swing, at least upon contact, it's a little bit more stiff, and because of the extra swing weight, you might have to be more accurate with this, so the timing is harder, but it definitely hits the ball harder and plows through the ball more. So on the volleys, Ezone was definitely easier to use just because it was easier to maneuver because of the lighter swing weight. So for reaction volleys and quick hands, this is definitely the racket to go for. But with this, it's kind of the same thing. Like getting the racket to prepare and getting the racket in place is a little harder, but once you get it in place, the ball really goes where you want it to go. And the frame, I think both of them have pretty solid frames. They're both wider than the racket that I use, which is the Radical, so the frames are not going to move as much. I think the Ezone has a thicker frame. But anyway, for now, that's all I have. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks, Joyce, once again for feeding me balls. And as always, have a good day. Peace out.